to the next of the factors which we can use to explain why the Nazi regime was so stable in the years 1933 to 1945, and that is propaganda and censorship. Now, I need to be very clear from the start that these two come hand in hand. And any answer and any argument which is aiming for the A&A star really needs to talk about how these combine simultaneously to have an effect, because alone one could argue they are less effective than if they are dealt with together, because they bounce off each other nicely. And so this is the argument that the reason why the Nazi state remains somewhat placid is less about the nature of the Nazi state, less about the support of the German people per se, but either through the manipulation or deliberate atomization, that's the separation of German society, through the media policies, both the information that you present, propaganda, and limit, censorship. And so there are several strands of arguments about the sort of Nazi state in terms of propaganda. One is sort of very standard year 9 and absolutely banned from my classes argument that it brainwashes you, that you see a photo of Hitler, you see it one time, it's a photo of Hitler, you see it 100 times and you love Hitler. That does not happen. That is not an argument. And I really want to make sure that in any of your writing, even if you hint that people are influenced beyond their control, that is a historiography that does exist. It's a crude one, and it basically serves straight after the war to justify the untold deed of all the Nazi state amongst functionaries and people you now will need on your side to fight communism. But apart from that, that historiography has very little validity. So if we're looking beyond brainwashing, we need to sort of look at the other ways it could affect. And this is where we start looking for analysis and looking for argument. The first one is that without propaganda, you can't have the cult of the Führer, something that we're going to talk about in the next video lesson, which in turn leads to stability. So cult of Führer is something separate. It is something independent of Hitler's role, but it is something nonetheless that without propaganda and censorship you will not be able to have. So it's a precondition of a separate factor. In addition, you could argue that propaganda works in combination with the material interest to create this general sense that under Hitler, under the Nazi regime, Germany is progressing, Germany is working. Essentially by controlling the negative information through censorship and by highlighting and exaggerating the positive sides of the state, you are generating this sense of consent. I will go along with this, as opposed to abject support and adoration. The idea that essentially many people don't like the Nazi state per se, don't like the Nazis per se, but will go along with them purely because Germany, compared to the Weimar years, Germany is going in the right direction. In addition, censorship in particular works effectively by avoiding and minimizing the number of things that will rally people against you, create a shared sense of grievance against you, and therefore inspire resistance against you by minimizing those negative news stories, negative actions away from the public consciousness. So those directly affected by, say, poor conditions in a particular factory or by failures in a particular battle may well experience it and have a negative experience, but it doesn't spread any further. It's like a quarantine of bad news. And therefore, if you limit people's individual bad experiences, the idea is that there's no one thing that everyone will rally around to think that is negative. And if you think back to many revolutions or rebellions today, or at least attempted ones, there's often one video or one event which triggers it. And the idea is if you sort of reduce the number of like shared, hey, those people in that city over there also dislike X, Y, Z, then you minimize the ability for people to, and likelihood that people will risk their lives and rally around it by resisting. So it's about creating this sort of it's almost, rather than trying to promote positivity, it's about reducing the number of things that will inspire rebellion and resistance by essentially keeping a negative experience to the home and the small networks that individuals have. In addition, you can create a sense of and encourage a sense of uniformity and conformity by minimizing the exposure to non-conformity, i.e. through art, but also news, and also create a sense that everyone is obeying, everyone is uniform, and basically kind of create this sense, encourage this atmosphere of conformity on the social side that we spoke about before. In addition, you can encourage people to join Nazi organizations through propaganda. You can make them seem more positives, and that in turn means that membership in turn creates that atmosphere of conformity and consensus. So these are the arguments that we are going to look at. Now, they are not all true, but so long as you're engaging with this sense of not just propaganda equals happiness, but you're looking at the mechanism, which is what these bullet points are, then you are on to the analysis. Because what a lot of students find in the propaganda paragraph is it's very easy to get to bottom B, C at, because you just point out some bits of propaganda, you say it makes people happy, and then happy people keeping Hitler in power. But to get the top end B and the A and A stars, you need to start saying how propaganda actually creates that sense, that consent, that support. And it's these things which will be the missing link, which often students lack in their analysis. So you really need to make sure that you are unpacking and using a couple of things in part of your explanation of why propaganda creates Hitler's power. So first thing is, it clearly does not brainwash. Okay, propaganda can spread feelings, can encourage basic ideas, particularly when it's using combination propaganda because with censorship. Because what censorship will do is it will minimize the countervailing narratives, minimize the counter arguments by removing them from public discourse and availability. And therefore, you can argue propaganda is quite good to send a general feeling of, for example, Hitler is good. Certain minority group is bad, and so on, and you can kind of sort of create sort of basic attributes and so on. But beyond that, you can't really make someone automatons and robots underneath you under control. If you're trying to sell an image that is so separate, so divorced from reality, people will reject it. If you're trying to tell Germans that things are going really well in 1945, they're not going to be persuaded. So you need to suggest, if you're trying to suggest that the economy is improving when it isn't, again, it's not going to work. So you need to always keep propaganda with the circumstances and the material interest of people at the time. And so propaganda is inherently therefore limited by reality. So you can't brainwash someone into, to some extent, a false state of things. You can only polish what is existing there. So that is the inherent limit in propaganda in what it does. Propaganda works best when it's used through association and linking to the emotional. Association means rather than simply saying a long rational argument why something is good, linking Nazis to positive things and enemies to negative things, both directly. Here is Hitler opening an Autobahn, more indirectly, Hitler through constant images of just general competence and leadership along the authoritarian model that we have seen many Germans are susceptible to. And if you are working to appeal to the emotional, this is good, this is bad, this is shocking, that works a lot better than having a long rational diatribe that has several counterpoints and arguments and well thought out. Because in reality, most people are not willing to intellectually engage with propaganda, particularly over sustained periods of time. You therefore need to tap into a far more subconscious and emotional appeal that people will go, yeah, that feels like how I feel, more than anything else. As well as that, it's quite clear that some groups are more susceptible than others. People with alternative views of the world, for example, the Junkers and the Catholics, are less susceptible to this because they tend to file propaganda when they see it as a Nazi gumph, and they tend to ignore it. Some groups who are more socially isolated or already more partial to Nazis as a default are more willing to swallow the propaganda without much question. A really important thing as well that Goebbels in particular pushes is saturation. Saturation propaganda is the idea that it's not just about having a message, it's about having a simple message which is ubiquitous, i.e. all around, everywhere and constant, which is more important than having a couple of bits of propaganda. So, for example, if you want to send a message that racial purity is good, you need to have it in all mediums, in culture, arts, film, music, but also in newspapers, news stories, and so on. And you need to focus on trying to push one simple narrative rather than try and make it too complex. Because obviously, if you try and do this too complex, or you try and make it too obvious that you're trying to push this idea that racial purity is good, people will often not understand and/or reject it. So, what you need to do instead, correcting a spelling error, what you need to do instead is to some extent pick your few key themes, over-bridging visions that you're going to reinforce through direct and indirect means, rather than have try and get people to remember Mein Kampf verbatim. Now this is good. This presents some strength because it means that you can get people to broadly agree with your policies and therefore broadly agree with you. But it also means that there's inherent limits here. saturation requires a constant simple message, which means that you might be able to get people to broadly agree with you, but they're not going to agree with every specific policy, and they're not certainly going to lose their free will, which is what the idea of brainwashing does. So what we're looking for in propaganda, when we're looking for it to be effective, is where it's trying to spread a simple thematic message that advances people's support for basic ideas of the regime. It's appealing for the emotion and working for association, as opposed to making people verbatim believe elements of Nazi ideology. So the first thing the Nazis need to do is shout and coordinate the media. What that means is they need to get control of the media and have complete monopoly on what is said. If you only have partial control of the media, it's very difficult to have a narrative, and particularly that saturation propaganda, because you're going to have competing narratives elsewhere. Now, under Goebbels, the sort of propaganda is much more subtle than it could be, and actually Goebbels, if you want to call it credit, deserves a lot of recognition, is probably the best word, for how sensitive and relatively sensible his approach is. Because you can go down one route when you try to propaganda of just shoving slogans and that's it. Goebbels' perspective on this is that if the propaganda Ministry of Propaganda, and which, by the way, he didn't want to call it the Ministry of Propaganda because his fear was, probably rightly, was that if you have a Ministry of Propaganda, people start recognizing that you're giving them propaganda and start ignoring it. He was overruled on Hitler on that one, and so the compromise was the Ministry of Propaganda and Public Enlightenment. Goebbels understands that if, while there is a place for direct propaganda and direct statements on Nazi regime and very obvious stuff, propaganda is as effective when people don't notice it's propaganda. So therefore, often it is in places where propaganda isn't normally, like culture, like the arts, but also like lifestyle sections of magazines and so on. And the only way you pull that off, the only way you manage to get Nazi ideals in a way that people don't see, oh yeah, this is obvious propaganda, and turn it off, is by subtly putting in the underlying message of Nazism. So instead of people going, the Nazi regime's policy when it comes to Nuremberg laws 1935 are positive, particularly clause 4, instead of that, you get the idea of, ooh, these people are racial enemies and are bad. That's the feeling you want to encourage. And this is at times too subtle for people like Hitler, and we're going to look at 2 examples of films where Hitler overrules Goebbels to try and get rid of that subtlety, usually to a less effective propaganda piece in the end. But generally what he's looking to do, therefore, is very much have, yes, his direct controls, for example, the Stürmer, but also to increasingly influence behind the scenes. So to make it look like things are being independently produced, make it look like papers are still not are technically the same papers that exist under Weimar, but ensure that behind the scenes they are under control and they are printing what they are being told, to try and keep some legitimacy and therefore receptivity to this. Because obviously if people suspect that everything is controlled by the Nazi state and everything is propaganda, they will just don't believe in nothing, and therefore the propaganda won't work because people aren't accessing it. So therefore some places like artists are regulated by the Nazis but not necessarily controlled. What that means is you can be fired as an artist and be banned from working as an artist, as Otto Dix, D-I-X, was. Eventually had to essentially give up doing art in Germany. Had to, but technically these people were still independent operators or autonomous operators. So artists could still paint whatever they wanted, in theory, but in reality, the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda ensured that those who did not paint the right things or do the right things were fundamentally unable to work, either through banning their works or passing their names on to the Gestapo. Some organisations are full-on shut down. Socialist newspapers and socialist artists are full-on closed, full-on stopped from working. And this is justified under the Reichstag fire decrees and the various anti-communist legislation. However, some organisations, particularly the print media, there is a little bit less sort of control. In clause 14 in 1933, this essentially gave the right to tell editors they had to remove something that the Nazis didn't want. This is the cornerstone of censorship. Essentially, they could say, we don't want you to print this, and therefore they can't. And this is very important. This means that you have a newspaper which is still independent, but you are basically removing any critique that you don't like. In addition, the Reichsministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda required newspapers to print a certain percentage of material which were Nazi created, i.e. the Nazis would write material and then the newspapers had to print them as if it was their own. This came a roughly half of everything written. So again, you've got these newspapers which are still the same newspapers they were under Weimar, but they're increasingly being told what to write by the Nazis, both what to not write and what to write, which basically means essentially the press is indirectly working for the Nazi Party and propagating its propaganda and censorship policies without being directly controlled. In addition, because Nazis don't necessarily nationalise all newspapers, but what they do is increasingly become shareholders. They increasingly own and buy out struggling newspapers and struggling press, and become their owners. So they don't close down them, but they become the people who own them and therefore choose the editors and therefore choose the policy. The ownership of the press goes from 3% in 1933 through to 69 in 39 to 82% in 1944. And this ownership of the press means that they increasingly sway what is being done. It's very important to recognise what's going on here, though. Stalin is just simply going to close all the press down. The Nazis, because they are more constrained by there being some residual power amongst the elites and middle classes, their need to seem legitimate and following legal means, and a different philosophy on the role of the propaganda, and I would argue probably a more effective one. They are working behind the scenes to get this control rather than just simply making it. A really good example of how successful this is looking at the Stürmer. The Stürmer is direct propaganda, it's slogans, it is just repeats, and most people don't read it. It's not popular, and there are many reports of individuals making a point to refuse to allow it in their house. But when you look at the ones which are popular, the magazines with photo features, celebrity gossip, and all that lifestyle stuff, which are similarly Nazi controlled but a bit more behind the scenes, remain popular. And Goebbels uses these to advance certain values, certain ideals, for example, emphasizing Hitler's role in Hitler's cult, and by putting him next to examples of success, for example, Autobahns and new building projects, but also advancing ideas about the role of women through the articles indirectly, without necessarily recycling the really obvious tropes and slogans. People are happy to go along with it. So the argument here is not that people universally reject all propaganda, it is they reject really obvious and open and crude propaganda, but the more indirect saturation, general propaganda, seems to be a bit more popular. And there is still opposition. The Frankfurt paper, which Frankfurt being a liberal bastion to the east of Germany, west of Germany, basically the equivalent. This paper was the equivalent of the Guardian today. Was up until 1936 remained critical of Hitler within the confines of what was allowed. So, for example, they couldn't say bad things about Hitler because of Clause 14, but when on Hitler's birthday, they could do a profile of Genghis Khan, making very clear. A very clear point about Hitler, and this gets away with it because it's widely respected by a number of the elites, and therefore to some extent unpopular, and also middle classes, and therefore untouchable without causing political problems. Now, what ends up happening for the paper is it runs into financial difficulties and is brought up, but that is a future issue. So this is not necessarily a story of the government takes complete control through direct means. This is instead the Rights Ministry of Propaganda taking control of the press surreptitiously and culture surreptitiously in parts, more directly in others, to control and coif the message behind the scenes so that at least these papers and at least these media operators are printing and doing what the Nazis want. Now, this is particularly the case in radio, because the Nazis are able to get complete control of the radio by 1934, where they're not able to get it by newspapers. Why? Radio is new. There's not many radio channels, there's not really radio frequencies which are operating, and those which exist again lack the necessary loyalty that a newspaper would do. For example, that you don't really have as many regional radio stations. So this means that it's easier, because there's fewer of them, and because they've got less reputation, and because they have less identity and supporters who directly support them, it's easier to slowly get control over them. And what this means is the Goebbels has this medium, this new exciting medium, this new exciting way to get people to like them with complete control over it. And so they go out of their way to make sure Germans have access to radio. They sell them at a slight loss, and which by the outbreak of war, over 70% of homes have one, which is far more than even America. And those who don't have them have access to communal loudspeakers operated to some extent by the block wardens. And the idea is that this is a entire stream of news, lifestyle, entertainment, which is controlled and coiffed by Goebbels. And the idea that everyone, much like, although this is declining now with the rise of Advent and Netflix, much like what people used to over the water cooler talk what is on TV, and that used to be the common thing that people used to talk about, that unity and that thing that brings people together to some extent, it would be the radio. Now, are people going to say, did you hear that chat from Hitler, that conversation from Hitler last night? Probably not. But if you pick the right topics, and if you make sure, as Goebbels did, that you have enough emphasis on entertainment and shows which have entertainment interspersed with propaganda, and those entertainment shows would be much more indirect in their use of propaganda than direct, then you could probably get that. And in reality, the Nazi sort of radio show programs in reality had far more emphasis on just general lifestyle than overt propaganda. They would propagate the idea that Hitler was good. They propagate the general themes of Nazi ideology about racial theory, about anti-communism, but they would also still be entertaining. And the idea there was to ensure that people would listen and on a conformity and basic theme level go along with the Nazi state. And so you could say to some extent that the radio programs are a bit more successful than print media because they have that ubiquitous control early, and they're able to get the message out there across Germany. It's still worth bearing in mind, though, many Germans are more than happy to use their government appointed given radios to tune into foreign language programs, and particularly as time goes on, the BBC's German language program, which obviously does a lot of the counter narratives to the Nazis, is very popular, particularly in areas where it is accessible in the north of Germany. And this shows that to some extent they're still not, even on the radio, there's still not complete control of what the news and complete control of what's said, and therefore complete saturation propaganda. Now, a key plank of saturation propaganda and Goebbels' idea is that propaganda needs to go beyond print. It needs to go beyond news. It needs to infect every area of life. And this means that you can do it really crudely and just shout Nazism, Nazism, Nazism over and over again, or you can be a bit more subtle. And a good example of the success of these relative ideas are the two films, The Eternal Jew and Jude Sus. Both are films which aimed to encourage anti-Semitic and therefore justify anti-Semitic laws and feelings against the Jewish minority in Germany. Now, The Eternal Jew was a film which was designed to be one of those standard films where it would encourage the basic anti-Semitism. So if the bad guy would be Jewish, along very anti-Semitic tropes, it would encourage the worst sort of racism and anti-Semitism against Jews by how they caricature and the actions and appearance of the Jews in the film, but then it also have a good story. Or at least good story for the audience who want to go and watch it. And it went back to Hitler for revisions, and in the end, it went after about 7 revisions where Hitler was shown it. He said more overt propaganda. It became less of an entertaining story for the average German, more of just this diatribe against Jews. And therefore, not many people actually went to go and see it or bought into it because it just ended up being this really boring sort of hate fest, which you wouldn't really go out to go and pay and see on a Friday night. So, whereas Jude Sus was a story of a strong Aryan woman, good-looking woman, and a strong Aryan good-looking man who are in love in the medieval times, and the bad guy who's a Jew covets her, and the heroic knight, and there's lots of fighting and glory and action, rescues her. Now, this has less overt Jewish themes, in terms of it isn't overt propaganda, but it really ties into the anti-Semitic ideas of the Nazi state. It really tries to aim to encourage a hatred of Jews subconsciously through how it caricatures the main villain of the piece, who's obviously Jewish. And this is roaringly popular, actually. Jude Sus is watched across Germany, and many Germans like it. And so in this message, we can see that to some extent, Nazi propaganda is best when it's subtle, right? Best when it's a bit more indirect. But we can say, how far does Jude Sus move Germans? You can argue that, yes, it perhaps encourages, alongside all the other stuff, and a more overt anti-Semitism, but doesn't necessarily get complete loyalty and obedience, and doesn't necessarily mean that people believe in everything to its logical extreme of Nazi policy. It just makes them a step more radical. So in this and in these examples, we get the crux of what this essay is going to be about. Propaganda is certainly helpful to generate consent. Propaganda is certainly helpful to create an atmosphere where people are slightly more likely to agree with Nazi policy, but it has inherent limits in how you do it and the extent to which you can persuade people. People certainly do not look at the Eternal Jew and suddenly become supportive of ideas which lead to the Holocaust, but they do become more dismissive and more anti-Semitic through policies by encouraging anti-Semitism that we have to admit is already in German society in widespread ways through Judas. So films in particular were Goebbels' pet project. He vetted every film himself. He also had numerous affairs with actresses and used his power over those in this area to sort of perpetuate and further those sexual liaisons, and really reflects his focus and his effort. We give only 1 in 6 films actually overt propaganda, and these are always the least popular films, and the rest of them, like Jude Sus, which had sort of Nazi themes and aimed to encourage Nazi values, but in reality still had a story that people could go along with. Documentaries were also used to sort of spread the sort of Nazi events and spread the sort of Nazi conformist rallies beyond those who were immediately there. And therefore we can say this was somewhat successful, particularly when it's being subtle. But there is a very strong difference between support, consent, and indoctrination. These films are too subtle to create this sense of, they are brainwashing and indoctrinating people. So at best, all you're doing is you're gaining a little bit more support by going up towards them and encouraging the values that you already support. Now, this is furthered through the use of images. Images are carefully stage managed, carefully encouraged to appeal to those base instincts and base emotions that Germans have and associate the positives with the regime and negative with its enemies. Because they have they're about giving a simple idea. They're mostly image based and they're mostly single issue based. These images are everywhere. For example, images of Hitler were inside cigarette packets in order to sort of give this image of this sort of one dominant Führer. And so what we see in photographs again is the idea of subtle, constant, but low level and thematic rather than direct propaganda and shift in what people think. We see a good example of how this was used was through the Olympics. The Olympics was highlighted as a triumph of the modernization of Germany. Almost 1936, 3 years after the Nazis come to power, is an example of look how far we've come. And the scale of the success in terms of the Olympics, but also the scale of building work, the scale of national profile is juxtaposed with what life was like before the Nazis to really show this idea and really implicitly give this idea that we have come so far. Music is another area where Germanization, quote unquote, happens. Operas are retranslated. Those operas which have Jewish themes are rewritten to have Christian themes. Jewish composers and performers are also removed. Jazz is disparaged but not removed because it does actually have quite a lot of popularity among certain sections. And the saxophone is banned by law. And there's a good picture there on the right hand side of it which summarizes the sort of the German attitudes and Nazi attitudes towards music. It's a much more trying to get those emphasis away from outside and Jewish influences to more German influences. This is a good example of what we're talking about. This idea of these are not writing songs about Hitler and singing Mein Kampf in verse to get people to memorize it. It is about encouraging the sense of Germanization and encouraging the sense of racial enemies by what you choose in the music. It is worth bearing in mind, like most things, there are limits. Because there are not complete controls over what happens, German tastes really remain the same. Reports seem to suggest that Germans do not like the rise of military band music and are still listening to hit songs, including from America, well into the war. So in reality, while there's a shift in music and the control of music, and you can argue that contributes to an atmosphere of conformity and to some extent limits, encourages this idea of Germanization and Volk, it is certainly not powerful enough to brainwash people or particularly shift people's values a more than a shade or a step. Art is the same. Now, I spent a lot of time reading about Nazi Germany, and I like to think I know a lot about it. I have no idea why the Germans make this. I read about it. This next decision we're going to talk about, and that is the Great and Degenerate German Art Exposition. Essentially, what happens is the Nazi Party put German arts into two categories. There is German arts, designed to encourage themes of German values and Nazi values. So here are some Aryans, strong male farmer figure, female figure at home, lots of children, and look how racially pure they are. Look, there's Hitler in the background. Look, there's a strong German male in a farm. Very rural, very Volksgemeinschaft. Look, there's also a strong German family. Look, the mother's caring, the boys are being boy-like, and they're in the rural scene. There's a strong male. Here are some nice feminine females. You're getting the idea. So the idea of German art was to perpetuate sort of Nazi values through, of Volksgemeinschaft, of racial purity, by normalizing these ideas and rejecting the ideas of the sort of Weimar era culture. And so what they did is they put on a Great German Art Exposition, showing all these examples of art to encourage the artists and encourage German people to sort of appreciate this art. And 600,000 people attend. Brilliant. This next part I don't understand, and I would welcome answers on a postcard, because they then decide, with all these captured and seized artworks which are deemed to be, quote, degenerate, before they put them away in vaults and burn them, they're going to have an exposition, and they call this the Degenerate Art Exposition, and they do this the week before, or 2 weeks before. And what they do is they show all the degenerate art, such as art emphasizing themes of pacifism as a result of the war. And you hopefully know a lot of this sort of art from our culture lesson. Expressionism, which shows art and painting styles which aren't naturalistic and don't mirror that's the real world. Ones which look at themes of vice, corruption, class war. Ones which look at terror and use styles which are disturbing, such as that of Otto Diesch. And they have this exhibition, and they go and they suggest it, and they almost make fun of it. However, this Degenerate Art Exhibition has 2 million people attend it. And the emphasis on which we can draw upon this is, however much these ideas of art here are being are encouraged by the German state, the German people's tastes don't seem to necessarily follow the government theme, with the degenerate art seemingly retaining far more interest and far more academic and intellectual merit than that of the patriotic art. So again, this sort of art is designed to create norms, is designed to create ideas, and you can argue to some extent it does, but again it's the same limits of how far is this going to shift more than the theme, how far is this going to bind if you don't like the Nazis, blah 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 blah. We see the same in architecture, encouraging this idea of national regeneration and renumeration of the Nazis. Hitler has great plans for the rebuilding of Berlin, most of which don't really come in, although there are some elements, and more radical elements and more radical architecture from the Weimar era and architects are removed. Autobahns particularly are really emphasised as images and sort of national progress and national growth, and Hitler is really associated with them. Partly it represents modernisation in an era where the car is still relatively new. This is an exciting, innovative work, but also shows the power of the Nazi state and the ability it's able to do this, and also is associated with the sort of public work projects which the Nazis credit for their rise. And so what we see across, from art to architecture from media to music, from film to photographs to posters, we see the deliberate cultivation of images, the deliberate cultivation of a sense of the world, and deliberate censorship of an alternate sense of the world, which the Nazis want to encourage. And this, at best, you could argue, helps encourage this worldview and this value system which is closer to what the Nazis wanted to be. And you could argue, because it's closer, over time people getting that value system close to the Nazis, and this creates a degree of consent and at least removes critiques and criticism for the Nazi regime. This, however, does not go beyond that. This does not make people fanatically loyal and indoctrinated on a really advanced, huge policies specifics, and does not work against groups who are not receptive. This is about shifting the susceptible people a degree and limiting the encouragement of those who don't like you to resist by removing any other voice that is against you, and therefore encouraging conformity. Now, this therefore requires censorship, Censorship is obviously the deliberate cultivation of a message through omitting stuff. The Nazis systematically and subtly censor, as we've seen all the way through. They ban artists from working. They control what goes on the radio. They control what editors print. And through this is really vital to ensure that propaganda works. Because if you've got one set of messages that Germany is improving, Hitler's a great man, the German state is remunerating, that this lifestyle was better, and then on the other hand you've got people willy-nilly saying the opposite, it's going to be hard to persuade people of your argument. If, however, you limit that, and if you, however, you only make there's only one side, you are giving your propaganda more chance to succeed. So that's the first way it works. It works by encouraging and giving more space for propaganda to work. The second way is a bit more subtle, but I think more important. People rebel when there is a sense of shared suffering. When people rebel when there is something to organise them. What censorship does is it removes both of those. A, by atomization, which is the idea of rather than if you've lost your job, you have very little idea if anyone else in the other side of Germany has also lost their job. The only thing it tells you is the media. So if you ban publication of unemployment, this means that you don't know if you losing your job is just you in your town or the entire of Germany at large. If you think it's the latter, you're more emboldened to do something about it. But by essentially saying you can't print and you don't know what's going on outside of Germany, it's actually very hard to know what's going on. And therefore you're less willing to take the risk to go and try and take on the national government. It basically isolates you to your own experience and your own network. And therefore, because you have, if you have 5 million people at work, rather than having them all sense, there's 4,999,000 people who are also like me, you know your town is like you. Your factory is like you, but that is it. And therefore you can argue to some extent it means you're less willing to rebel. In addition, by controlling what is said and who says it, you're reducing the ability for particular newspapers, particular individuals, particular artists, particular groups to become this thing that everyone rallies around, become this thing that encourages people to say, join me, we are against them. It basically makes it impossible for groups, individuals, societies or newspapers to define themselves against the Nazis and become a site of opposition, something to unite and you lead rebellion against you. So what censorship does is it essentially separates people, atomizes people and removes the ability to sort of control and organise against them. And therefore this is really, really, really important. However, censorship will only work so far. If people are happy to discuss how much they hate the Nazis, if people are happy to discuss how obvious and bad the Nazi regime is, happy to discuss stuff like unemployment and suffering in the war because there's no terror and there's no conformity, then you're going to have negative ideas spread more freely. So censorship will only works effectively if you also have an atmosphere of conformity where people also don't want to spread and talk beyond their comfort zones. In addition, if people have incredibly negative experiences, no amount of censorship will make them still not hate the Nazis. And so censorship is good to make people stay at resistance and loyal reluctance, but it doesn't help create consent. In addition, people are also aware of that censorship. Just because there's not news doesn't mean that people assume bad things are happening. So it's not like censorship leads to love or support. It just limits people's direct resistance because they don't know how bad it is, they don't know how much national support there is, and they don't have anyone to rally behind. So essentially, people know that it's going on. There's distrust of news, there's distrust of propaganda, and therefore censorship is not perfect. So people don't just because there's an absence of just because there's an absence of bad news doesn't mean Germans suddenly believe, things are going well. It's not that naive. But the key thing, because you have propaganda, it's if you don't like Hitler, it's because you have censorship, because you don't like Hitler, it is impossible to organise people on a national scale against Hitler. If you're an elite, you can have your private conversations. If you're the church, you can have your backroom conversations. But it's impossible that the entire of Germany around them because you just simply can't get the message out. There's no means to spread that hatred of Hitler and that hatred of Nazis. And so if we're looking at sort of how does it work, clearly, the top one doesn't work. However, in terms of generating consent, propaganda and censorship is very helpful to encourage that cult of Hitler, which is vital. It's very important to help encourage this sense that all the material interest gains are working and are due to Hitler. And it's important to minimize those negative aspects in the national consciousness. But the rest of them, I would suggest, are very much subtle or partial, depending on which group and depending on the time. There's not really a sense that people buy into propaganda in a mass sense to create conformity and uniformity. And there's not this sense that people will join the Nazi Party because the media tells them to. And so when we talk about propaganda, in conclusion, yes, there is this mass coordination. Yes, there is this idea of trying to push Volksgemeinschaft. But ultimately, the propaganda is effective where it's creating this general sense of positivity and these general attitudes that Nazis share rather than specific Nazi parties' policy on stuff that Nazis want you to do. And to some extent, this is something which only works insofar as you are also simultaneously improving the material interests of Germans and you have a terror network to balance the negative arguments. If you have propaganda and censorship, but life is terrible and you're convinced of depression, you ain't keeping people happy. Likewise, if you have censorship but you have no teeth to it, i.e. you don't put people in Dachau, then again people are going to spread information against you and they're going to become sites of opposition. So where propaganda does work, it is in combination with stuff rather than anything else. And therefore, while propaganda is important as an adjunct, I would say it's very hard to sustain it as the main cause. It is something that is almost the glue between clauses to make the most of material interest, to enable cult the Führer, to balance terror and control the image of terror, and requires terror than it is of anything on its own. And therefore, propaganda we should really sell as this thing which makes other things happen. It avoids the negatives, it encourages the positives. It's like a cheerleader. It is not, however, a factor that brainwashes in and of itself makes the Nazis regime stable. Okay, that was a bit of a longer session, and I look forward to you seeing in the next video. Apart from that, good luck.